I'm really delighted to have Alexandra Mousavizadeh today from Tortoise Media to talk about the work they're doing on the Global AI Index. We're also thankful to the ESRC for funding the centre, of which these debates are part. One of the reasons we wanted to invite Alexandra to talk about her work that I heard her present at the all-party parliamentary group on AI was because it relates to some of the issues we were discussing in series 1 with Duncan Galley on how do you do international comparisons. And in that debate from Duncan, we looked at issues around how in the 1970s, there were talks about universal trends of ubiquitous changes that technology brings in. And he was drawing on some of his work to look at how we do two-country comparisons of Britain and France, or as exotic as three-country comparisons with including Germany back in the 1970s and 80s. And by looking at other countries, what can we learn about the way these technologies have been introduced in our own country in different ways, and how that adoption and implementation varies for a number of reasons. Now, a quick sprint from the 1970s and 80s up to the 2020s, we've seen a massive growth of benchmarking indexes using very multiple dimensions and including many, many countries, 20 to 60 or more countries. And really, Alexandra's work is part of that current trend in comparative research, where we're looking at these multi-dimensional factors. And there are a number of new indexes coming out. So we're just really appreciative to understand how you've built your index, why you do it, and what can you tell us about the findings when we get them. So all the details about Alexandra's great experiences in these different areas are all on the website. So you can read those there for yourself. So I'll hand straight over to Alexandra to hear what you've got to say about the Global AI Index. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me, Jackie, and everyone in the room. So great to be here. And I would say, there's a lot to talk about, and please put in the chat anything specific you want me to address while I go through the work that we've done on the AI index, but also maybe taking everyone back a bit in terms of like, why do we do indices, as to Jackie's point. And I guess there are three things that I'd love to see if we can cover today as to what Jackie said, is like, why do we build an index? Why did we build the AI index? What did it ultimately tell us in terms of international comparisons, and how do people use it? How do we use it? But maybe just stepping back a second, as you know, I have spent my entire career in building indices. I'm an economist and mathematician from Copenhagen, and spent the first part of my career in creating methodologies and indices on sovereign risk models. And through that work, the appreciation of all of the issues that you face when you're trying to standardize data across very different types of economies, and trying to come to one unit that you measure countries across, but also what these indices do, that create a race to the top, if you will. And having run, not only debt sustainability and debt risk indices, but also was the head of the Prosperity Index that looked at the broader definition of national success. What indices do, and what I've seen in my career, is that they do sharpen the focus. Countries do tend to compare each other to their regional neighbors, but also neighbors on the ranking of the index. And it starts to put in motion thoughts around what are best practices, what are other countries doing that are seeing success, or the opposite, and what can we take away, what can we learn from that. And often you get into conversations about what's exportable, right? What are some countries doing that is successful for them, but actually is unique for them as well? But what actually can be brought across borders and used in the context of one's own country. But anyway, so that sort of tool of behavioral change, that and the nudge that indices can do and be for policymakers, not only measuring externally, but also often to be used as a tool for nudging domestic policy prioritization and decisions and funding decisions. Often indices get used for that to sort of lay bare, where there are issues and where there should be a focus. And we certainly have experienced that with the AI index. But so to just bring us back to why the AI index and what was why did we build this? We're 3 years into it now. We started the process about 4 years ago, just at the same time as James Harding and Katie Vanek Smith founded Tortoise Media, and I was one of the partners that joined from the get-go, and had just started a conversation with the then Danish Prime Minister, who had brought together a disruption council, which was looking at the sort of impact of tech and AI in particular and how a nation should sort of position itself vis-a-vis AI. What were the policies that should be wrapped around AI, and what are all of the elements that go into building a sound AI ecosystem? And that was just at a point where Canada had issued, as the first country in the world, a national AI strategy. And now we have 80 national AI strategies. So it was definitely something that was top of mind for many governments, and governments were looking for a benchmarking tool that would properly measure and track and monitor the AI ecosystem and all the bits that go into that. So we built a board, and we spent about 10 months building the methodology. And it is a slightly unusual index because it rests on what we would call unstructured data. So usually, many indices would take World Bank data. They would, use maybe some OECD data points and IMF data. But we were also, from the conversations we had with our advisory board, that very well aware that the ecosystem, for example, in the growing talent pool that you would consider as an AI talent pool, wasn't obviously coming out of the universities themselves, but were also forming outside, as in a lot of people were taking online courses. There were meetups and hackathons that were AI focused. A lot of the coding in AI were taking place on GitHub and Stack Overflow and Kaggle. And there were many, many ways that you would want to try and get around and have more than just a few indicators on talent. And we ended up with 48 indicators on talent, just to sort of give you a sense of trying to really get to all of the dimensions of the talent. But just to step back a bit, what we did is that we created an index that covers 62 nations, about 150 indicators. More than 60% of the indicators are drawn from big global databases, and they're live feeds. So we can watch today how policies that get issued and adopted and implemented, how that impacts the data itself on a real-time basis, which is relatively, I guess innovative, but very useful for policymakers, because you can sort of see the immediate impact of a policy that gets implemented on the data, and see how that then moves a country in terms of its ecosystem. So you're very close, like a Germany and France, if there's policies or funding that goes on in France where is not taking place in Germany, France can immediately see how they potentially pull ahead. And for people who follow and track our index, corporates that are looking to invest somewhere in Europe, they would be looking at that index to see where the strongest talent is, or research is, or where the best infrastructure is, or operating environment, and so on. So we track across 7 pillars. And maybe now is a good time to pull up the slides just to walk through what the pillars are. But so just to go back and answer sort of why did we build the index? We built the index because it was a response to a request, first from the Danish government, and now from most of the governments that are in the index, are using it as a tool to either update or structure their AI policies against, or use as a tracking mechanism for their ecosystem and see the impact of the policies that they're putting in place. So that was the reason. That was exactly the reason why we wanted to create it. We wanted to create something that was properly useful, that was comparable on an international basis, but that was useful for domestic policymakers that hold the leads on AI policy making and making sure that it was, constantly up to date, but also very, very relevant. And actually, for the next update in May, we are probably we're looking at building in some additional indicators on national compute power, because that's sort of where the debate is going. And if we can start tracking national compute power, which is very relevant for AI development, that would be of great use for the countries that are mapping their ecosystems. So that is why we built the index. The international comparison part in this particular index, it was complicated because using these big data pools like Crunchbase or GitHub or Stack Overflow or even Kaggle are quite Western language skewed or Western hemisphere skewed. But we did spend a lot of time working out how we would and what proxies we would add to make sure that the activities in China, for example, were also properly represented. So we did do some calculations there in terms of creating a proper representation from China where the data might be a bit thin, and I can go into how we did that and how we did some of our imputations. But so doing a big global index like this that is fully comparable is, I would say, difficult. And there are areas, and also in the Middle East where there are different types of platforms that are used. So it doesn't always completely capture what's going on. But we are always working on padding and using and updating and adding to the sources to make sure that it is as deeply comparable and accurately comparable as possible. And so I guess the best, I think what I'll go to now is what does it tell us, which is we had bets on the table in terms of the ranking of the countries. And I think that sort of the top 5 are probably, intuitively makes sense for most people. But even that, when you look at the scores themselves, I think that we were surprised by the gaps between the countries. So I'm just thinking, I think, Megan, you're holding the reins on the screen. So if you look at, so here's the overall performance if you just rest here. And the AI debate is so often characterized as an AI race, and that race is taking place between the United States and China. And which is true. Those are the dominant nations on AI innovation, development, and implementation. And there are areas in China where China is very advanced and probably quite far ahead. But if you look at the ecosystem as a whole, there's actually quite a big gap between the US and China, and then between China and the UK. So while they rank first and second and third, with Canada in 4th place, might make sense. Well, it does make sense intuitively. If you scroll down a bit further, you'll see how the scores land. So by adding up all of this, if you go down a bit further to that image there, you will see that the outlier all the way to the right, you've got the US, and around the 60 mark score-wise, you've got China, and then you've got the United Kingdom all the way back there with a score of 40. And I think that, and there might be some issues with the China data. Maybe it's slightly closer, but having run through this with a lot of experts, they were saying, no, this makes a lot of sense. And this is sort of our assessment of it, sort of without the data, this is where we would think, this is where we think it would come out, which was interesting. And I think that was sort of quite interesting for people tracking the gap. And then the UK being sort of a big sort of step behind China is also maybe not so much of a surprise. We've done the calculations on what Europe against China and US would look like. And of course, that gap is then, of course, much narrower, but still there's a gap. Now having the index in the 3rd year, we have a lot of back data to look at, and we're also starting to be able to track sort of how the countries themselves are moving vis-a-vis each other. And what we noticed in the release that we did of the 2nd AI index in December compared to the first one, which was in December 19, the year before, is that while the UK still holds the third position, that third position is now perhaps less robust, as not so much on account of the UK losing on many areas, other than there are some areas on the compute power and some infrastructure, parts of the infrastructure pillar that has softened a bit, but that's also very much on account that the other countries just behind it are putting a lot of effort and spending and focus on their AI strategies, and it's really starting to show. So we're looking at, we ran a model to see if that continues and the UK stands still, that could jeopardize that position of a third place in the global AI index of the United Kingdom. So that's interesting to now the UK is coming out with a new AI strategy this year. So there's probably a lot of these things that will be addressed, and we'd see that pick up in the following iteration of the index. But if you just scroll down, and I'll take you through, if you stop at the pillar weightings, that is just to give you a bit of a sense of sort of how we view the various pillars, and not all of the pillars have equal weight, as you can imagine, but the three core ingredients that go into a strong ecosystem on AI is talent, research, and the commercial side, and then hence they weigh the most in the index. And after that, you've got areas such as infrastructure and development, and then operating environment and government strategy weighs the least. We have maintained to keep the government strategy in the index because it's important, signposting on where the priorities lie. But it is also somewhat, I would say, inaccurate, because there are a lot of countries such as Israel that doesn't have an explicit AI government strategy, but has a very strong implicit one, with a lot of the funding going through the military, and a very strong natural ecosystem for AI development. So that's why we don't weigh that particular pillar particularly strongly, but we do flag it. Something that with the Biden team in place now, we've been discussing with the new team at the White House about their government strategy, and as they're just about to embark on setting out a new one this year. And they were, for example, curious to see where in the government strategy, or actually overall, even with the US ranking so highly, that there are still areas that, if you look at the individual indicators, where there is some softening, as we see. And so that's, of course, lovely to know that they are using the index as a sort of a guidepost to thinking about how they're going to set things up, among many, many other inputs that they use, of course. If you go down a bit further, here's just a way that we track each of the pillars year to year, both on the ranking itself, but also on the score, so one can see if I've just pulled out the UK dashboard that that goes really deeply into the UK data, but of course the global index has all of this for all of the countries. But if you scroll down to the top of the dashboard, here you can see sort of how we treat the indicators. And here you've got your pillars across, and what they rank for the UK and how they score for the UK. And this is just how we track it on a sort of a week-to-week basis. And then we can go into, let's say if you clicked on GitHub commits, the top one, you can, if you just click on that one itself, and you can just see sort of how it unfolds. So GitHub commits would just show how, the UK compares to sort of a selection of countries, or against the whole index, or against Europe, or against, any which way that we want to look at the comparisons. So that's sort of that's how we use the index. That's how policy makers use the index, and we sort of track things on a month-by-month basis or a week-by-week basis, and we make sure that we have all of the auto alerts on areas that we're tracking, whether it be for the UK or whether it's for Germany, or whichever country that we're sort of doing some deeper analysis on, that we can then see for each of the indicators where they might suddenly be slipping below a country, or taking off because there's a policy decision and an implementation of something that we're seeing the results of. So that's just sort of give you a sense of sort of how much detail that we go into. And then we also do a simulation tool out of the index, which means that you can put in targets and you can simulate, all else being equal, what a given country would, how it would be positioned given sort of, you know, specific policy changes. And that can just help in terms of when governments are setting a sequence and they're saying, we want to do these 10 things in the next 5 years, but where do we start and how do we want to organize ourselves? So that helps with that. So that's sort of how we use it, and that is all sort of meant to be sort of, you step back and you say, well, you know, it's not supposed to be a race. You know, in AI, we're supposed to be considering, you know, much more, you know, considering sort of how do we collaborate, which of course also goes alongside all of our work, is like how are countries collaborating and how are they borrowing from each other's ideas and implementing, you know, forums where we can discuss, like we did, for example, yesterday with many of the governments involved in the index. You know, what can we learn from each other? How can we sort of pull some of the best ideas on the policies that have been implemented? So in some ways, you know, yes, it's an index that puts countries on a ranking, and that, you know, gives a sense of competition, but actually there's an enormous amount of collaboration that goes on sort of within our universe as well. So it sort of does both, but it does it does have that nudge behavior, and does this is, I think, the first time that the AI ecosystem has been mapped to this level of granularity. So it really does help countries focus on the areas where they feel that they want to do better, and they want to focus on. So it does have that nudge effect, which I'm very pleased to see. So I think that it's. I don't know if you want to jump in with questions here, Jackie, or if I should just maybe finalize. Maybe we can step out of the slides and we can go back to the screen. But I hope that gave you.
Yes, that's a brilliant. That's a really great kickoff, just on the complexity of the indicators. I've already got 2 questions in the chat, so let's bring them in. So first of all, Simon Deakin, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? And after Simon, there's Tommaso Chiarelli, excuse me, bad Italian there. And would you like Tommaso afterwards, after Simon, to ask your question? We take those as they come along, because I know there'll be lots. Simon, fire ahead.
Oh, thanks very much.
Yourself, sorry, for people who don't know you.
I'm sorry, I think Tommaso was first, but I'm happy to go first, Jackie. I'm Simon Deakin. I'm a member of the Digit team based at Cambridge. Alexandra, thank you very much for that presentation. Really interesting. So I was wondering if your index captures regulation of AI, and not just both positive and negative. So sometimes countries are unhappy with the effects of AI or the way it's used. So recently in France, there were laws passed to stop the use of AI to measure judicial performance. And in China, there's been a really big pushback recently against deep learning and machine learning in finance, with some restrictions on peer-to-peer lending. Does that appear in your index? And so does a country's score go down if it negatively regulates AI?
It is one of the things that appears most in the conversations that we have. It is a very big and important topic, and it does not appear in the index yet, I would say. We gave it, when we started the methodology build now 4 years ago, it is the question of ethics and regulation, data privacy and protection, were the things that it was an ongoing discussion from the very outset of the build of this index. However, it was also, as you can imagine, a very difficult thing to do from a metrics perspective, because, things that there are practices that go on that are not, regulated, and there are regulations that get implemented that doesn't necessarily mean that the output is good, right? So China has a really, really good ethics paper in conjunction with their AI strategy, where the AI ethics reads like, I don't know, Sweden's, right? But we know that the implementation side is, is a very different story. So we were looking at inputs versus outputs, and how do we capture, the argument is that if you create the foundation and the policy framework is there, you would expect a positive, a positive outcome, but that is not necessarily always linked. So we sort of backed away from that, and we're now working on exactly this topic with a variety of people we've added to our board to really work out how do we best do this? How do we best capture and there's lots of ways to do that. I mean, there's some people who are capturing issues related to the regulatory side and the misuse of AI, and the areas where the lack of explainability and issues with bias and facial recognition and all of those things. But we just see, if they're brought to court, countries that have a lot of court cases with that are obviously countries where, even if the regulation may or may not be in place, that there's an issue with the output clearly, right? So that would be one way to do it. But it is something that we are grappling with from every aspect, that, as you can imagine, like both looking at the input and the output. And hopefully by the end of the year, we'll come up with some kind of a framework that will capture this exact point. And I will keep you. But as you can imagine, it is, from a metrics perspective, it's quite tricky. But I would invite anyone, very distinguished group here around the table today. And I'm sure you spend quite a lot of time thinking about this. So we'd love to have any additions and thoughts you might have in terms of how you would tackle it from an index perspective.
Simon, do you want to come back? Because you are actually doing quite a lot of work on that, just so we can have a conversation about this as well.
No, of course. I mean, I thank you very much, Alexandra. No, I agree. It's just very difficult to measure these things. And I guess one has to be clear about the purpose of an index and what it's really trying to capture, and then have some consistent understanding, I guess, across the different categories of the dimensions you're seeking to capture. Can I just ask one follow-up question, which is related then, which is, what do you understand by AI? I often have debates, especially with fellow lawyers, about what it means. And is it just machine learning, or is it all forms of automated decision making? And is that something you've had to grapple with as well when constructing the index?
Absolutely. And actually in the, we try and map it out sort of as precisely as we can in our methodology. And actually in all of the indicators, we are constantly faced with what is the definition of AI. So when we're looking at talent, what talent, right? Because there is a sort of a wide range that sort of gets stuck into in an AI bucket, but not all of it, you would say, is AI. So I would, so when we sort of, when we look at, how we scrape Crunchbase, for example, right? And so, the use of AI is tagged with all of and there's a list in the methodology of what we tag for when we, but it's quite broad, I would say, because we're looking at sort of the ecosystem is, it's sort of, even if you're on the fringes of what you would define as AI, it still sort of supports the ecosystem, which is what we decided to go with. But and as you can see, if you go sort of through the talent pillar and the way that or Crunchbase, you can see all of the ways in which that we tag that, and we tag LinkedIn, the way people, express sort of their experience, and the sort of about 6 or 7 categories that we have that are included in AI. Now, that question came up again yesterday because we had a meeting with the ministers from Finland, Israel, and Greece, who drive their AI policies, and they wanted to broaden it much further and say, well, actually, it's also about digitization, and digital penetration in a country is sort of the rails in which AI eventually runs on. So if you've got a better digitized economy, you can also, or government services in that case, you could say it's sort of the building blocks for AI. So actually where it stops, we're quite specific about it in our methodology, but in conversations, it often gets mixed up with sort of a wider range. But I'd be curious to hear sort of when you work you say, for example, ethics or regulation of AI, how do you usually characterize it?
I have not been coding AI laws, but I do code other laws, and I always think it's important to have a consistent understanding of the particular dimension of a law that you're trying to code for. Laws have many potential uses and therefore different dimensions. So if I'm coding employment law, I'm going to code it normally according to a binary outcome. Okay, either the law gets stronger for workers or weaker for them. And I'm trying to be consistent across different types of law, so I don't mix up separate dimensions in one index. I appreciate the difficulty. I had a quick look at your index right now, and maybe I'll have a closer look in due course. The devil's in the detail, isn't it, with an index, as I think we both agree. And indices do different things. Ours really measures what the law is aiming to do, and I think yours is perhaps trying to capture multiple dimensions of what I take to be an environment in a country which is conducive to the growth of AI. I think that's a complex undertaking, of course. Yeah.
It's not dissimilar actually to other undertakings in the past. I don't know if you followed the Innovation Index or the Competitiveness Index. I mean, they sort of are in the same family of indices where it's sort of the ecosystem, or even the Democracy Index that the EIU puts out. I mean, that is, again, sort of what are all of the elements that go into having a healthy democracy, right? And we're trying to do the same. What are all of the elements that create a conducive environment for innovation and then also for deployment of it?
So just one final point. I mean, it might be then that with some regulation, you get more innovation. I mean, it seems to me if you're in China clamping down on misuses of deep learning and machine learning in the financial sector, that could be beneficial for innovation in the long run. Although how firms respond to it, I guess, in the short run, it remains to be seen. It could be negative. I'm not absolutely sure, whether regulation is always good or bad.
I mean, I think the European argument on that is that it's good, right? Long term, right?
Yeah.
The white paper is saying that the more robust the regulatory environment is, actually long term it will thrive, which that's sort of a discussion in and of itself. Sure. I think the European issue is more the question about, yes, of course there should be proper regulation, no doubt. I mean, we can already see, it's sort of a car that's racing off and there's like no driver behind the wheel. That's sometimes how it feels. So there's no doubt, but everyone's sort of still admiring the problem, I think, and everyone's finding it quite difficult to sort of figure out. Now the white paper in the EU is put forward by the EU is definitely a step in that direction. But then there's also the question of regulation versus the pace of innovation, and is the pace of innovation hampered by that, or actually is the pace of innovation in Europe hampered by other things, that is a fragmented data pool or fragmented access to compute power? Because if every nation is creating their own compute power, is that good, or should we have something that is more overarching that everyone can tap into? And those discussions are, and that discussion was, I sort of said up front, the whole sort of question about compute power is becoming very top of mind for policymakers on AI. But then the question is, who owns that compute power? Is it a public space, or is it owned by the private sector? And again, back to how do you regulate it? And the sort of data standardization and data pool size is very important, as you know. And one of the reasons that China is so successful is that they've got access to a very big data pool that you can train on. But I don't know. So it's the regulation is something that still really very much keeps us up at night, I can tell you.
Thanks very much.
That's great having that exchange between the two of you. There are a lot of questions coming in, which is great. I knew that this session would end up people being hungry for more, so we won't get everything done. There are a lot of questions coming up about indicators, which we want to look at. But I don't want the whole conversation just to be about what does this indicator do and that indicator, because there are quite a lot, and I'm sure Alexandra's had a lot of discussions with her team about that. So I'll take some of those, but I'd also like us to think about how does this kind of analysis inform theoretical understandings for why some countries are at the front and some countries are at the back. So when we were putting together the book Work in the Digital Age, my colleagues Florian Rampf and Max Neufeind, we had a whole load of 25 countries, and we said, okay, how are we going to group these countries? It's not just going to be an alphabetical telephone book. And what framework could we use to compare which countries are at the forefront, which are laggards, and which are in the middle, and why? So back in 2017, when we were putting the book together that came out next year, we looked on the European Digital Economy and Society Index there, and the countries at the front were not necessarily the ones you would have thought that might be there. So my dear German colleagues were not happy to see that they weren't number one. They talk a lot about it, but they were rather disappointed to find that, for example, Spain was much higher up in terms of public sector digitalization. Anyway, never mind, the book's out there if you want to have a look at it. I think what's interesting about these indexes is also not only just to see how the rankings are there and how they change over time, but how do we explain who's at the front, who's at the back, and who's in the middle? Clearly, your data's got quite a big gap between China, America, and everybody else behind. Once you take those two out, it's trying to understand which bits are accelerating the changes or not. But so anyway, the point is I want to take some of the questions that are coming in about indicators, but I also want maybe at the end of it to think about how we use this type of data to think about how we create explanations for who's at the forefront or who's lagging behind, etc. Right, on the list, Tommaso, would you like to introduce yourself and ask your questions? Then it's Slato, Kevin, and Elena, and I'll check out who else is on there. Right.
Sure. Hi, hi, Jackie. Thanks a lot, Alexandra. That was great, and really nice to see these development. And I think you've done a really amazing job. So I have really quick questions, which actually do relate the questions about indicators and the question that Jackie was just raising now about how to use them. It is hugely important because, as you know, there's talking about AI everywhere, but we know very little about AI. We know very little about the statistics, and you're doing a great job at the country level. And what I'm asking is whether some of this work that you're doing at the country level can be useful also at the micro level, which might help us a little bit more to understand questions that Jackie was raising about who is doing, but also who is adopting and who is using. So who is doing for what? So I'm taking an indicator here that you had, which is I was looking quickly, number of R packages which are downloaded, which I think it's a great idea, but that's a very broad understanding of capabilities, right? Which could be related to AI, could be related to anything else.
Yeah.
But how does this tell us? And do you have any data that you're using in terms of looking at domains of download and users in GitHub, authors of papers and patent assignees that can lead us to a better understanding of how this is distributed within countries, who is doing what and who is using what. So you have these downloads, which are fantastic. Why are they using these algorithms, which packages in R, which may be and NLP algorithms, for example, distinguishing from other algorithms, from the other scripts. So what I'm getting to is can you develop a little bit more the data to understand a little bit more at the micro level some of this information about who is doing what for whom and who is adopting and what? Yeah,
that was a lot of really good questions. I mean, just if I first of all, if we can, I'll take the micro level first and then go to why sort of things like R package downloads, Python package downloads, etc. And maybe actually I'll start with that one, because when we started to sketch out how do you define the activities and what all of the things that go into the activities in AI, there's lots. And actually you look at R package downloads or Python package downloads, and you say that's not necessarily that linked. It could be used for all kinds of things. But when doing a long list and assessing that with our board to work out should we keep it in the index or should we not? There was still sort of a sense that actually, by and large, it's sort of it's not a strong proxy, but it is still an important part of that ecosystem, even if it's slightly more removed, that we felt it was strong enough to keep in. The way we treat it in the index, though, is where you We don't weigh it that much. With the way we created the ratings was the sort of the direct relevance to AI innovation and the strength of the data source, right? And this actually got very low weight on both, because so if you took it out, none of the you wouldn't see any changes in the rankings. But it's there to make a point that actually you can make two decisions, types of indices. You've got to make a decision from the get-go whether you either do a very simple index with very few indicators that we say, look, these are the leading indicators in our view, and you might only have 10, right? Or you can do what we did, was that say, look, no, let's measure the whole ecosystem, and let's actually have a lot of indicators that are trying to express what that ecosystem is doing. And the reason we did that is because we're using this very fragmented data sources across many countries, is that if we had simplified it, there are simply countries that does not get any representation. Russia is a very good example of that. Russia does not show up that much on GitHub, does not show up on Stack Overflow, is not seen on MOOCs, is not there in terms of actually, weirdly, in research. You would think there'd be a strong research presence and the H-index or IEEE or any of the places that we source citations or representation at conferences, but they're not, right? But then they have a very strong showing on Kaggle. And if we hadn't had the Kaggle, and you can say it's a slightly obscure one to put in, but there are some countries that actually got picked up. And we know that, of course, there's a lot of funding going through the military in Russia, and you see the output on the streets in Syria with, drone warfare, there's, object recognition, and there's all kinds of, and the hack in the US obviously is, demonstrates a certain level of sophistication, but that we can't, and it's in a closed unit, right? And it's hard to find. So that's why we stepped back and we said, we want to have one that's very rich on indicators. And that's why some of them might seem slightly odd, but but they're there to create as many proxies as we can. So that was a decision that we made. And so micro level, being able to take sort of that next level down is sort of our next phase of the index, as in what sectors is it going to, where is it being used, how do we really measure adoption rates? And we talk about this all the time. How do you measure how much a country is actually, the UK is a lot of innovation, and a lot of funding going to AI startups, but the actual adoption rates is slightly harder to get. And so there's, yeah, exactly, right? Because a lot of, people get out of town and, they develop to a certain extent and then they leave. But it is, the adoption rates in China are obviously much higher for obvious reasons, right? But a clear-cut way of measuring adoption is something we're still, we have it there as a proxy because we're looking at how much are companies hiring to implement AI, but we can't actually see what they're implementing yet. So we'll get there. It's very exciting, and I can't wait to sort of develop something on the micro level. Actually, we were thinking micro level in a different way, which is there's some interest in the UK of looking at how the various parts of the UK are developing in different ways and on different things. So trying to get a sort of a UK regional assessment, and is actually something that other countries are looking at too, just to sort of figure out, how do you nurture hotspots within the same universe or the same country? So anyway.
Great. I have got quite a lot more people on their list, so I might take a bunch of 3 if you don't mind, just to give everybody a chance to speak. So Zlatko, Kevin Hernandez and Elena are on my first 3. And if you briefly introduce yourself, Tommaso was from SPRU at Sussex University. So over to you, Zlatko in Leeds.
Yes, you kind of introduced me already. So I'm Zlatko from the University of Leeds. I'm interested in understanding broader pictures, so I have sometimes a little strange questions. And my question is, I saw a couple of months ago a presentation on AI from the UCL, and it was the main story was, or one of the key points was, the development, the current development and future development of AI is not so much the story of countries, but increasingly a story of corporations. And an example was that Google bought some leading, very innovative AI companies, and some of them from the UK. So, and Björn Åke Lundvall has written a paper saying that, speaking about knowledge predation by these big tech companies. So my question is it possible to capture something like that? How do you capture something like that? Could we somehow bring in the impact of these companies, big tech companies, maybe put them, maybe even compare them to the countries and saying, hey, this is 4 countries, but maybe number 5 is Google, okay? And would be interesting to do that. Thanks.
We actually had that ready to go in December. We had treated the big platforms as nations, and a bit for fun, and placed them in the index. The problem is that there are so many indicators that, and I completely agree with your point, because actually, if I don't know if Marc Etienne is in this meeting today, but Amazon, AWS, or Google for that matter, has R&D budgets that far outpace DARPA's, right? And the whole shift of, if you read Mariana Mazzucato's book on why we have the iPhone and why we have so much that we are enjoying today, is all resting on, the defense spending that went, or the spending and the support that DARPA gave, that was risky investment and long-term plays, and some things worked and some things didn't, but that ultimately the government funding was good because it took the risk, but it also developed these things that were very hard for the private sector to make a punt on back then. And that today, the question about, but that's sort of a question about how do governments, how should they organize? And the UK is obviously looking at that today in terms of, how much to fund ARPA and ARIA and so on, and how much money goes there. And what is the role of these, setups? Are they incubators? Like, for example, if those of you who joined the meeting yesterday, the way that Israel has structured a sort of a incubator, government-led incubator system that funds the private sector. And sort of what are the roles of that? But then actually, to your point, when you look at the big platforms, they are, so they're spending more than the Canadian governments or the US government or the UK government put together, just one company. Right. Exactly. So that throws up, and you said big picture, right? That throws up a lot of questions about, who ultimately decides where that spending goes, who ultimately decides on how that gets used. It's a good thing for having R&D. Are we happy that sits there and not in the government? What, and what can one do about it? And what does that mean long-term, right? Because the DARPA investment 20 years ago or 30 years ago is what we're seeing, reaping the benefits of today to some extent. So, I think that's a very good question. I think, we were going to put a piece out on treating these companies like nations in terms of research and development, in terms of leadership, in terms of, looking at the metrics. Probably 30% of our metrics would map onto them, and then the rest wouldn't, because the rest are about, country infrastructure and, or things that wouldn't relate to a company. But I think that that might be something that we would do sort of as a separate piece for the next release, just to sort of make sure that the sort of the scale and size of the companies are now, of a completely different order than 20, 30 years ago.
Fascinating stuff. I'm going to quickly run through. Kevin, do you want to ask your question briefly? Elena, David, perfect, Amani, and Juan. You've got about a minute each to just pop your questions in, and Alexandra can pick up what she can. I knew we wouldn't cover everybody, but okay, Kevin, do you want to fire ahead and briefly introduce yourself for those who don't know you?
Hi, my name is Kevin Hernandez, and I work at the Digital and Technology Cluster at the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex. So I have 2 quick questions. I think they're quick because they're both methodological. So my first one is, did you look at ethics at all? And where does ethics show up? And how did you measure it? And the second question has to do with something that I found interesting that you said, which was that the UK alone is quite far behind China and the US. But when you start to look at Europe as a whole, it starts to get closer. So my question is, does this have to do with the index in some way privileging countries that are bigger? And if so, how did you kind of compensate for that? For example, if you're like looking at GitHub and downloads, and if you're looking at it just from a purely quantitative perspective, it's kind of unfair to expect Estonia to have the same number of downloads of our packages as you would the US or China. So how did you compensate for that?
Oh, if I can take your last question first, because that's actually, Jackie, when you were talking before about sort of pools of profiles of countries that emerge from an index like this, that is very much to your point, Kevin, as in, no, we most of the data points are in proportion to the size of a country, right? And that's why when you see in the last ranking, you could see, Israel is number 5 now, but you've got smaller countries there that are quite high up in the index, and they could only be there because the data is is released in proportion, not in every instance, but in most instances where it's relevant and possible that we create that that proportion. And that's also why these clusters of countries emerge, right? And we can see that they have commonalities, right? The ones that are small, we call them small intense nations, because we look at AI startup investment compared to GDP so we look at all of that, and in a way so that gives you a much better sense of the priority of a nation when it comes to AI innovation development and funding the talent that is needed for it. And that's why those countries show up. And I think that's very interesting. We didn't do everything by proportion. And if you did that, actually the UK would slip a lot, which was interesting to me, but we had a balanced approach to that. So ethics, it is the most debated topic within the team and at every meeting we have. And it's the hardest thing to grapple from a metrics perspective, as we were talking about before. It is something that you look at inputs versus outputs, and there are a variety of ways that we're looking to incorporate an ethics angle in the December release of the index. So but again, as I said, any input on that, I mean, highly appreciated, because we spend a lot of time grappling with that. So
I'm going to sneak in a quick question as well. How do you think our research centre should use your index? And while you're in terms of what its consequences for employment and work, while thinking about that, Elena, would you like to briefly ask a question and briefly introduce yourself? We've got about 4 minutes left-ish.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Jackie. So I am an advisor from the Colombian government, especially from the Office of President Duque. Therefore, I would like to mention briefly that Colombia has the first ethical framework for artificial intelligence in Latin America, and also has a model for regulatory sandboxes and experimentation. But my question is related to developing countries. So how do you envisage including developing countries in the index, and also sharing these results with developing countries?
Good. Can I just collect the last questions? The next person, David Perfect, who has a question, and then it'll be Amana and Juan, and then we'll let Alexandra finish off. And if you need to go, then you have to go. If you want to stay a little longer, we can keep it open a little bit longer. All right. So David Perfect, you're next. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah. So I'm Dave Perfect. Until recently, I worked for the Equality and Human Rights Commission in Great Britain. My question is whether the index sheds any light on the equality of impact of AI in different countries. So are you looking, for example, to see whether, as part of the index, whether in some countries AI is particularly benefiting some groups, such as white men or young people, and not others, like women, disabled people? Thank you.
Can I just quickly answer that? I mean, yes, we actually, in our last newsletter, and I invite everyone who, I don't know how one does this GDPR wise, but I'd love to put you on our newsletter. We went last time deeply into the question of you know, all of you know, gender issues and ethnicity representation, and how that's a problem literally at the entire sort of gamut of AI, right? Both from the, you know, people who, you know, skew a lot, you know, it skews male, right? So you've got a lot of the engineers working on it, and so you've got biases built in throughout this, and also on the output in terms of the way that it's used in the end also doesn't necessarily favor minorities or women. So we look at that a lot. We actually work with the Turing Institute on this, and have used a lot of their studies in our work, and have surfaced data that sort of we share. And I will make sure to send you what we did last time exactly on this topic. So we do look at it. I know we're sort of out of time, but Elena, I just quickly wanted to say, great to have a rep from Colombia. We're particularly interested in you know, the sort of the data visibility sometimes can be a little hard in developing nations. We do think that we are, you know, as an index, you know, we need to have a standard approach to every country. So we don't do a different standard for, you know, I would say developing versus developed countries. However, it's something we've thought a lot about. And, you know, in a way we were, and this is a separate conversation, but we were asked to look at developing the index specifically for Africa, right? And if you do that, right, the sequence and the importance of the pillars actually change, right? Your infrastructure has to be in place, because you can have all the talent in the world, but if there's no infrastructure, sort of a digital infrastructure, then it doesn't matter, right? So if we did that, we would slightly re-weight the system, and we would probably come up with a slightly different version. But at this stage, we're keeping everything equal and treating every country equally. I know we're out of time. Should we just take one more question?
Yeah, absolutely. So Amani and Juan, can you ask it briefly, Amani?
Yes. My question is, how did you treat, Alexandra, the data factory and AI outsourcing? Because this is clearly employed by one country, but effectively is happening in another country, but also not all countries are using the same thing. Some countries do not use outsourcing at all, and some countries they heavily outsource, or they heavily use data factories. Others do not at all.
Do you mean data factories as in data labeling, the labeling of data, or
yes, all the services associated with training data?
Yes, it's such a good question. We actually at the very early when we were putting the methodology together, we were trying to see if we could build in some assessment of sort of inequality of the production, if you will, of AI. And actually the whole data factory or the data labeling was so interesting. And there's actually many reports that look at that, and how, you know, that is often done maybe in lower income countries that is supporting the rails upon which that, you know, AI is being used in the developed world, right? So in a way, you have a risk that there's further inequality being you know, produced out of just producing the AI. So it's not something that we explicitly capture in there. It's something that is always in our, you know, we're always thinking, should we find a way we can put that in? It is something that we address on the outside, but it is very much on our mind, and it's a great question. Thank you.
And the very last question, Juan, you have the last word, and can you tell us where you're from as well?
Thank you very much. So I'm Juan Grigera. I'm from King's College London. I'm in the International Development Department. And sorry, it's a really simple question in a way, and I don't want you to go into a full comparison of the methodologies that roughly, I mean, I can see they're quite different, but it's interesting to see the AI vibrancy global index, which is an alternative way of measuring this, and attempting a similar benchmarking exercise. I mean, yours is fascinating, and it's nice to see all the details. I know all all the pain you've been through in thinking about this. But do you see do you compare with it, and do you see the results, and do you have a clue of where the different the different rankings come from?
Yeah. I mean, you mean the vibrancy tool out of the Stanford Index, yeah?
Yes. Which also allows you to do the weighting yourself, which is a strange decision. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people like to have that flexibility. I personally don't like that system at all, because I think that if you're a company, maybe you'd like to have a flexibility on things that we actually do a big CSR or sort of ESG index for the FTSEs. And sometimes that's kind of nice to say, look, we are a bank, so we can't, so there's certain things in the SDGs we just can't do anything about because so in that case, it actually does make sense to reweight you for a sector, right? But in this instance, look, I love the work that they do. We're very close with the Stanford team. We, compare and contrast, we share ideas, but their system is theirs is quite different because, while they go deep on research and talent, and to some degree, they also look at some diversity scores and they look at investment, but it is, we go the full gamut, right? We look at operating environment, we look at trust, we look at infrastructure, we look at strategies, we look at public funding and private funding. So ours is a sort of a deeper set of metrics that, obviously will throw up different, results because we take more things into account. I can't remember their rankings off the top of my head. But I think they're not that dissimilar at the end of the day, but I'll have a look. I can't remember. I mean, I've been looking at it for so long, just sort of on the methodology and the metrics, but so I can imagine that it would it would be relatively close to ours. So I would say, how does that? Yeah, it's relatively close.
Some differences are interesting, but that's a bit.
Yeah, I seem to remember they have Singapore quite, there's certain countries that are, completely opposite from ours. And it'd be fun to sort of check out what is it that we include that creates that change. And so, but it's a great tool, great people, great team over there. I would just want to say that we do we have an AI Network Roundtable that has been born out of the conversations in creating the index, but also after. And it's a monthly roundtable that I host with my fellow partners at Tortoise and the team behind the index. And if you're interested in joining, get in touch and let me know. And if you want to perceive some of our research that we do on a bi-monthly basis, then also just please let us know, or let me know. I've put my email in there, and yeah.
Well, fantastic. I knew there'd be brimming with loads of questions. We can't answer everything in an hour, but it's really great to have a taste in more depth of what you're actually doing and exploring some of those issues. These conversations will carry on. So I really appreciate, Alexandra, the presentation today. And let's see how some of our team decide what bits to explore and what further collaborations might be possible. And there's lots of thank yous coming into the chat as well. So on behalf of everybody, Alexandra, thank you very much for coming, and we'll carry on the conversation.